Well, there is a lot to discuss. Let's meet our panel. Yan Liang is an associate professor of economics at Willamette University. She joins us from Portland. Here in the studio, Jeff Moon is an international trade consultant and president of China Moon Strategies. Also with us, Saruhan Hatipoglu is a global economics analyst for CGTN, and from Beijing, Zhao is an assistant research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome to all of you. Saruhan, let me start with you. There is a deal. It's been described, as you heard President Trump say there, as a phase one deal. It's not substantial, it's partial. But what do you make of it?
Well, and I think I'll shamelessly take credit of it. Remember, for 3-4 times when we were here, I said there would be a numbers-only deal, even when the skies were really gray. And this is what we got. But we got something else in there. The IP issues, I personally did not expect would be in there, but it is in there. Now, it's partial, and it was expected to be partial, because if you look at the agreements that we've seen with the US and Japan, for example, there was also a phase one in there too. They left the auto issues, IP services issues to be discussed later on. So I'm glad that both sides decided to take a concrete step about this, on this issue, and they did not allow the perfect solution to stand in the way of a good one. And I think that's what we got today.
Okay, let's go to Beijing. Zhao, hi. Seems like a prolonged trade war has been averted for now. One of the concessions that China has made, one of the agreements it has made, is to purchase between $40 and $50 billion worth of U.S. agricultural produce. China also agreed on guidelines on managing its currency. So how significant is this?
I think, first of all, let me say that China's side statement just came out, and from the Chinese reading, there's no deal at this point. China stated there's a substantial progress on many fronts, but so far there's no deal described by the US side. Particularly, Chinese statement didn't say how many phases or what phase is this. So far, there's agreement, as you said, by agricultural purchase and also currency issues. So this is, I think, China shows its willingness and sincereness to reach the deal in the future and to accelerate the negotiation in the coming month. So far, I think because of the size of this deal and the issues involved are so complicated, it's impossible to get this done in a very short period of time. We predicted a long time ago that this will come in limited and phased style. So I think this is in line with the Chinese demand, also in line with Trump's style, because if you look at other deals that the US has done with other countries, including Japan and European unions, so far it's also a very limited step-by-step deal. So I think we're moving in the right direction, and China will continue to purchase US agricultural products because of domestic demand. And in the future, I think more progress will be made.
Yan Liang, what do you make of this? As we just heard, China says there's no deal. I guess the problem with that is nothing on paper right now. These are just talks that have taken place, but not a comprehensive deal. But is there cause for optimism?
I think so. I think at least from so far, what we have heard that both sides seem to agree on some of the items, such as increase in agriculture purchases, which China has been doing earlier this month. So I think that is probably pretty certain, and also the increase of assets, market assets to financial services sector to US firms. I think that is also pretty aligned with China's announcement of opening financial sectors back in the summer. And in exchange, President Trump will cancel the tariff hike that would scheduled to take place later next week. So I think that is probably some very certain outcome from this trade talks. But there are more in the making, things like intellectual property rights protection and technological transfer, and also whether or not the tariff hike will go through in December. And those are still unknown. So hopefully we'll see more positive news coming along, because I think that would be really good for both countries, given their current economic situations.
Jeff Moon, it's a mini deal, but the key issues were addressed according to what we heard at the White House today. That's tariffs, farm purchases, as well as progress on forced technology transfers and intellectual property. Nothing on paper yet. It's going to take another 5 weeks before they write that down, so both sides can have something to sign. But how big is this?
Well, I think you put your finger on what's really important here to notice. There are some actions, some concrete actions that we know are going to happen now, and then there are a whole lot of promises. The only thing concrete that's going to happen today is that Trump decided to defer the October 15th tariffs, and China is going to continue purchasing agricultural products. The rest of it is all promises, and we've been here before, and we had a deal that was 85% done and nothing happened. So I'm very skeptical about the promises. As I look at the concrete actions, in fact, none of those actions have anything to do with the core issues in this dispute. So this deal feels a lot like, to me, like prescribing aspirin for a patient that has pneumonia. The patient is going to feel a little bit better, and the symptoms are going to disappear temporarily, but the long-term underlying problem is still very threatening.
Plus, the other thing is that we didn't hear anything about how this is going to be implemented.
They talked a little bit about it in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
And the controversial issue for China is whether tariffs would be removed during the implementation phase. In fact, however, prior to the Trump administration, there was a year-round trade process that will probably be resumed. And it involved lower-level discussions that fed up to higher-level discussions that fed up to principles. And we know how to do that. Mm-hmm. The Trump administration claims it has to reinvent everything, that no one did everything before them. But in fact, all the people, the career people that manage that process are all in place, and they can snap back into that in a heartbeat.
Saruhan, there was a time when President Trump said that he was not interested in a mini deal. He wanted a comprehensive overall deal to be done, but he's changed his mind. What do you think forced that change?
The economy.
Yeah.
If you look at the numbers, manufacturing September activity came its lowest level in a decade. Services, lowest level in 3 years. And if you look at the employment report, there was something to celebrate by the market because they looked at bad news as good news because the Federal Reserve would probably reduce interest rates. But the job reports itself pretty much told us that employment growth is slowing down. You look at businesses, the investment activity has declined considerably, and rightly so because there's not much confidence going on as to what is going to happen or what was going to happen. Even today, I completely agree, we don't have a done deal, at least some steps towards a deal. But so all of this uncertainty and an election that's going to be coming very soon for the United States, I think prompted President Trump to rethink the issue, because the only thing right now, in my opinion, and data tell me so, that is supporting the U.S. economy is consumer. And if consumer spending slows, which these tariffs, if latest tariffs, if they're implemented, that would definitely be slowing down. That would be very bad news to a president who's going to be facing a re-election and at the same time an impeachment inquiry right now.
Are we getting to a very busy shopping period?
It will be, definitely. A lot of people are happy, consumers are happy. But again, there's also the concept of economics is really more art than science, and expectations play a role in here. So if this mini agreement doesn't materialize in the next 2 to 3 weeks, at least some details emerge, businesses are still going to be less confident, and consumers are going to be very careful as well.
Zhao, hi. I want to turn to one of the things that President Trump talked about in the Oval Office, and that is China's commitment, he tells us, to purchase between $40 and $50 billion in agricultural goods. Let's listen to what the president said. Let's watch this.
A tremendous deal for the farmers, a purchase of from $40 to $50 billion worth of agricultural products, 2.5, 3 times what China had purchased at its highest point thus far. So they were purchasing 16 or 17 billion at the highest point, and that'll be brought up to 40 billion to 50 billion. So I'd suggest the farmers have to go and immediately buy more land and get bigger tractors.
So, Zhao, here we have the president saying that China, at the highest point, was purchasing between $16 and $17 billion. That now goes up to $40 to $50 billion, if these figures are correct. That's a huge commitment from China. What does it get in return?
Well, I think one of the things that's important is that agriculture is one of the leverages China's been using in this trade war. And I think it's becoming more and more clear that Trump is worried about his rural state support. And so far, because this year, it's already October, and China's purchase of U.S. agriculture has been down substantially. And so far, China's just playing catch up. And also because of domestic issues, China in need of increasing agricultural products purchased from the U.S. And also China can reduce some of the other purchases from other countries to focus more on U.S. High-quality agricultural products. So at this point, I think China's promise for more agricultural products is to give President Trump a political support in exchange that he would postpone and later on probably roll back the tariff. I want to emphasize 2 points. Number one, I think in China's statement, in terms of substantial progress, it included the dispute settlement mechanism. So I think the implementation has already achieved some kind of progress in the past negotiations. So that's very important because previously China said those things are infringement of China's sovereignty, and now we probably have some kind of agreement. And secondly, I think it's important that moving forward, these issues are already laid on the table, and because they have already talked about the IP issue and also other issues, financial service opening up, China has been making progress on its own, not without the negotiation. And now, because of the progress, the U.S. can basically agree upon the substantial progress has already been made in China and making further inroads in those areas. So I think you combine this together, we're optimistic that the written agreement will be reached in 3 to 5 weeks. But like your other commentators mentioned, that this happened before, and because China still has doubts that before this finally ironed out, this deal is not finally done. So that's why China is not talking about deal at this moment.
Jeff, a bit of an irony there that China will extend a political lifeline to President Trump with these promises to buy more agricultural produce in the United States, because that group, Midwestern farmers, are an important constituency for the president.
Well, there's no doubt that this will help the president, but frankly, my feeling is that there have been no concessions or no goodwill gestures here, that both countries are only doing the things that they would otherwise do and want to do for their own reasons and their own purposes. China needs the food. Trump really doesn't want to impose taxes on consumers right before Christmas. And these are all one-time transactional things. And the tough part is when you get into implementing the promises through paper. I've been there before in the government setting where principals that can't really agree on something give the working level the task of actually putting that into paper. That is a lot harder than Trump made it sound in the Oval Office this morning. That's why things have broken down. I think China is going to try to recycle old promises on financial services, on IPR, on currency, and try to have it done with that. And that is not the core of this dispute. The core of this dispute is issues dealing with the industrial policy of China, and we're still far, far away, I think, from wrapping this thing up.
Yan Liang, we heard the headlines today, of course, and as Jeff points out, the hard work still has to come, getting this down on paper. There was a piece in the Financial Times today which said that this deal may be too limited to remove all the uncertainty surrounding the United States-China relationship. Clearly, a lot of work to be done. How do you see the challenges ahead?
Right. I think here are two issues. One is whether this deal is too limited, and second is whether that deal would really go through. And I think we need to be a little bit more optimistic on both fronts. For one, I think a mini deal, an early harvest deal, is still a good deal. It's a partial deal. We all know that. But I think no bad news is good news. We have seen some signs of politicizing the trade talks, and fortunately, both countries didn't go that way. And I think with these partial progress, it opens the door for further productive trade negotiations. And I think Mr. Moon is correct that both sides are gaining something from this recent trade talks. China needs the food, the U.S. needs the political support. I think the farm issue is very important for Trump. And as we know, from July last year to June this year, we have seen a 14% jump of the number of farms that filed the Chapter 12 bankruptcy protection. And that led to the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, said, we need to bring this trade conclusion soon to ease the pain on the farmers. So I think China is giving a big political ease, a political gift, I think, for President Trump. And on the other hand, I think China has shown the sincerity recently by purchasing agricultural products and also by reining in the depreciation of the Chinese yuan. If you remember last year, yuan devalued by 5%, but this year it has regained 2%. So I think a series of changes and actions have shown that there is a room for both countries to reach a deal, and that could lead to further more progressive deals. But of course, there are all of the issues. But I think as long as Trump does not go into messing with China's sovereignty, asking for hardline structural changes that would, change China's state-led economic growth, then I think both sides would have some agreements down the road.
Saruhan, the markets like what they heard today because the Dow was up, the commodities indices were up as well. But there was also something else, and we've heard this for the last few weeks, that both the World Bank and the IMF have been telling us for the last few weeks that this dispute between China and the United States is hurting the global economy. They, in fact, downgraded global growth forecasts.
Absolutely, and it is hurting the global economy. But I think it is also important to look at it from a longer-term perspective on it, because one of the reasons, and I've heard that from the panelists here too, but I think there's a reality here that the Chinese side is now realizing that there's bipartisan commitment to dealing with China on these matters. It is not Republican anymore. It's not President Trump anymore, because we're looking at the criticisms and we're hearing criticism coming from the Democrats. So it might as well be that the Chinese delegation or the Chinese team sat down and said, look, we're going to be facing this whether it's Republicans or Democrats. But coming back to the economy thing, we talked about the U.S. part of it. Well, China is slowing down as well. July-September quarter is 6.1%. That is the lowest quarterly growth in 3 decades. This is not a joke anymore. They're feeling the brunt of it. So both parties realized that this was the time to do something, to send the right message to the markets. By the way, the markets are smarter than what we sometimes make them to be, because a lot of the, during the day, the Dow Jones almost hit 500 points. The agreement announcement came in, it almost hit 500 and then went back to 300, 320 points because there was no detail in there. So they're going to be watching this, and the economy is definitely going to be impacted by what is going to be on that paper, not in actual rhetoric.
Just one point on the role that Congress, the U.S. Congress, will play in this, Saruhan. Will any kind of deal have to be sanctified by Congress? I mean, as Congress really told the president, we've handed this over to you, but we can take it away from you too.
Well, I'd be swimming on Jeff's lane here answering this question, but no, it is not, because the negotiations are going to continue with the executive right now, as we've been seeing, and the low-level trade talks are going to take place. And again, the issues that Congress might be involved in, the IP issues, forced technology, state subsidies issues, are nowhere to be found yet. So it is going to be the executive, but Jeff, take it away.
The reason that it doesn't need to go to the Congress is that this is going to be an executive agreement. It will not be a treaty. So the U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement is a treaty that needs to go to the Senate for approval. That's why it's very political. That's why it can't be passed. This agreement can be approved by Trump and implemented. And if I could just say one thing about timing here. Timing is very important. It's important they do this expeditiously. There is a window between the Chinese anniversary celebration, before which China really didn't have political flexibility, and the real beginning of the U.S. political campaign, which I would say is February the 3rd, the Iowa caucus, or earlier. Within that window, there is political space on both sides to make progress. After that, we're going to have to wait until after the election. The election's just going to be too hot. And Trump will not be able to make other concessions and really deal the way that he would like to.
Right. Zhao, hi. Given the time constraints on this, how much pressure is there on China to get a deal sooner than later, rather than later?
Well, I think the pressure is always on, and China's economy is under pressure, like you have already stated. And an interesting thing is that even with the tariff added, the import-export price in the United States has continued to go down for 5 months now. So the real reason is there's a shrinking of demand in both countries and globally. So I think that's why IMF and World Bank came out and say that the global economies are all under pressure. That's one thing. And the other thing is that it's very important to think not only in terms of trade, but also an overall bilateral relationship and also regional and global relationship that these two powers play. With the trade deal, with the improvement of trade sentiment, I think it will help to improve other aspects of bilateral relationship. And we've seen deterioration of this strategic relationship in the past month, and because of all the thorny issues that lie between the two countries. So that's why when Trump said this warming up of relationship that he's feeling is really should be echoed from Beijing. And I think China would like to see a better sort of political environment in the United States dealing with China. And I think one thing I wanted to point out that even though maybe there's a bipartisan consensus on how to deal with China, but there's a great gap between Washington and American people. The recent poll came out from Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs shows that the majority of Americans support engagement with China, support cooperation with China instead of this ideas coming around to so-called decoupling with China or getting more tougher with China, that breaking the relationship in the future. So I think I remain optimistic about this relationship, and hopefully this temporary trade deal will improve relations in the future.
Good point, Jeff. Is President Trump in tune with American public sentiment on this?
Well, I think what was just said is very important about decoupling.
Yeah.
I think what has happened is that since negotiations broke down in May, that the White House has been looking increasingly for more and more leverage. And that has allowed the hardliners inside the White House, in the name of pushing for more leverage, to actually promote decoupling. So that's where you get talk about delisting and Xinjiang and piling on other issues. And that's why, even after today's deal, if you ask yourself, do we have more or less issues than were on the table at the beginning of this trade dispute? It's actually more. And so that's something that's against us. I don't know to what extent the American public supports all of these things, but for each of these different issues, there is a constituency in the United States.
Right. Yan Liang, let's look at what was left out, something that we didn't hear about today, and those are some big issues, like, as you pointed out earlier on, the demands for structural change that the United States has been making. Some of those changes, they want China to change its domestic laws, for instance, and as you pointed out, that would impact on China's sovereignty. Also, Huawei, we didn't hear anything about that.
Right. It's been said that Huawei will be taken care of by a different process. And I think one of the really thorny issue is, Trump seemed to trying to suppress China's technological development. We just heard on Monday that he blacklisted 28 China's tech giants in the name of human rights violation, and Huawei ban is still in the process. So I think this is one of the problems where, when two countries are competing, right, in technological development, then I think both sides needs to find a way to collaborate and cooperate instead of, only just the competition. And the other thing I think you mentioned earlier, the structural reform when it comes to China's economic model. I think China sees this as a very important sovereignty issue, and it's not going to make concessions on how China is going to structure its economy. And I think Trump should really not go that route.
Okay, and we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but you can listen to more in our podcast. We'll be covering stories from around the world in a bit more personal and candid manner with our guests and correspondents. And the conversation also continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America. Or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.